The trial, where a dog took the stand. You've heard of trials where witnesses lie. But what happens when the one who reveals the truth isn't human? Noah Cross didn't ask to be a hero. He just wanted peace. After Afghanistan took his voice and mobility, he found one reason to keep going. Shadow, his retired military K-9. They lived in silence until a child next door cried for help. Now, Noah faces charges. The news calls him violent, unstable. But what happens next in that courtroom when Shadow walks forward, obeys a silent hand command, and uncovers a hidden clue will change everything. This is not just about justice. It's about what loyalty looks like in motion, what truth smells like under pressure, and how sometimes the ones we dismiss as just a dog are the ones carrying the whole story. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above the courtroom, casting an anemic glow over the polished wood panels and worn tile floors. Dust hung in the air, nearly imperceptible, catching in the streams of light like old ghosts suspended between truth and judgment. The room was full but not loud, just a low static of whispers, shifting chairs, and the soft tick-tick-tick of the old analog clock mounted high above the judge's bench. Everything about the space felt restrained, like the air itself was holding its breath. Noah Carrigan sat at the defense table, motionless in his wheelchair. He wore a plain dark shirt, sleeves rolled up slightly, and simple slacks that bunched neatly where his legs failed to move. His hands were folded gently in his lap, still, firm, silent. His face gave nothing away. No twitch of the mouth, no flicker in the eyes. But if you looked long enough, if you looked closely, you might notice something beneath the surface. An edge to the stillness, a kind of discipline that wasn't passive but chosen. Like a man trained to sit inside fire without flinching. At his side, lying on the cold floor with the same composed stillness, was Shadow. The German shepherd's black and tan coat glinted softly under the overhead lights. His ears were up, his head forward, not in threat, but in unwavering focus. He did not pant, he did not move, but his eyes scanned the room slowly, deliberately, the way a soldier watches a perimeter long after the shooting stops. Across the courtroom, the prosecutor paced before the jury like she was orchestrating a performance. Her tailored navy suit was sharp, her voice sharper. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, turning on her heel and gesturing toward the defense table. "This is not a trial about sympathy. It is not about pity. It is not about what this man used to be." She let the sentence hang, then stepped forward, voice rising. "This is about a choice, a deliberate, calculated act of aggression. A man, Noah Carrigan, who, though suffering from trauma, took it upon himself to invade private property. And worse, he used a trained dog, bred and conditioned for war, to inflict physical harm on a civilian." A few gasps murmured through the gallery, but they faded quickly into silence. Some leaned forward. Others shook their heads. Noah didn't move. Neither did Shadow. The prosecutor turned, her heels clicking, and pointed directly at the dog. "This animal," she said, "was trained to detect explosives, track hostiles, and, if necessary, neutralize threats. He was never meant for civilian life. He was never meant for neighborhoods with children and families." Shadow's ears twitched but remained up. "This wasn't a dog protecting its owner," the prosecutor continued, now walking closer to the jury box. "This was a weapon deployed by a man who has failed to adjust to civilian society, a man who, despite his decorated service, allowed his trauma to turn him into a danger." At that, one juror, an older man with silver hair, shifted in his seat and glanced toward Noah, the way people do when they're not sure whether they're looking at a hero or a ticking clock. From the back row, someone whispered, "Wasn't he in Afghanistan?" Another answered, "I heard he saved a whole unit." But none of that mattered now. Not in this room. Not under the cold watch of the law. Noah's court-appointed attorney, young, nervous, tie slightly crooked, sat beside him, fidgeting with his papers. He cleared his throat but didn't speak. It wasn't time yet. And when it was, he feared he wouldn't be enough. From the witness stand, David Renner sat, jaw set, eyes full of injury, whether real or rehearsed. He watched Noah like a man watching a bomb he doesn't know how to defuse. The judge, a woman in her late 60s with thin, silver-rimmed glasses and a face carved from decades of hard truths, gave a brief nod. "You may proceed with the witness," she said calmly. The prosecutor walked toward Renner. "Can you tell the court, in your own words, what happened on the morning of March 12th? Renner adjusted in his seat, speaking clearly for effect. "He just came into the yard. No warning, nothing. His dog charged at me. I was standing by my back door. I didn't even move." Across the aisle, a few people looked at Shadow, who remained still. One woman pulled her child slightly closer. "I didn't provoke him. I didn't even see the guy until it was too late," Renner continued, shaking his head. "That dog came at me like I was the enemy, teeth bared. I thought I was going to die." The court reporter's keys clacked softly. The ticking clock kept rhythm. Shadow didn't blink. His eyes remained fixed on the man. Noah moved one finger barely, but it brushed gently across his knee. Not enough for most to notice. But Shadow noticed. Outside the windows, the wind began to pick up, rattling a loose pane of glass. Inside, everything stayed locked in place. No one quite knew what to expect next, but even without words, something about the air had changed. The judge narrowed her eyes and turned her gaze briefly to Shadow, then back to Noah. "This court recognizes Mr. Carrigan's military service," she said evenly. "But this case is not about service records or past heroism. This is about whether or not the defendant poses a threat to civilian safety." She paused, then looked at the clock. "We'll resume with cross-examination shortly. Court is in session." But as the gavel echoed, a strange unease settled across the room. Not because Noah spoke, not because he moved, but because the only thing scarier than a man who yells is the man who sits in silence while the truth waits just beneath the surface. And at his side, the dog who never blinks. David Renner leaned slightly forward in the witness chair, his fingers clasped tightly in his lap, as if rehearsed. His voice was steady, too steady. "I was just standing by my back door," he said, eyes flicking to the jury before settling on the judge. "Didn't provoke anyone, didn't say anything. Just heard the gate creak and suddenly that dog came charging at me like I was some kind of threat." He pointed directly at Shadow, who lay next to Noah's wheelchair, unmoving, eyes focused on the witness like a sniper watching for a tell. "That thing is trained to kill," Renner added. "It lunged. I barely got my arm up before it bit." His sleeve was rolled up slightly, revealing a neatly bandaged forearm. As if on cue, he winced and rubbed it. A few members of the jury shifted. Some looked toward Shadow again, perhaps expecting a snarl, a twitch, anything to confirm what Renner described. But the dog didn't move. His ears remained still. His breathing was slow. His eyes, however, were locked on the man in the witness box. Not blinking, not flinching, just watching. Noah sat upright in his chair. His gaze wasn't accusatory. It wasn't even angry. It was blank, unreadable. Only the subtle tightening of the muscles in his right forearm gave any sign that he was listening at all. The prosecutor stepped forward again. "You're telling us, Mr. Renner, that there was no warning?" "None," Renner replied, louder now. "One second it was quiet, and the next second this attack dog was tearing into me." The courtroom stirred, and then so quiet that only those closest would notice. Shadow's ears twitched, just once. Noah's hand moved slightly, just his right hand. His thumb folded into his palm. 2 fingers slid down in a slow, practiced motion. It was a command so subtle it could have been mistaken for a nervous tic. But Shadow saw it. He rose. Not fast. Not suddenly. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He stood with controlled, almost surgical intent and began walking each step purposeful, silent, soft as breath, toward the witness stand. The prosecutor froze mid-question. A few jurors leaned back. A woman near the front gasped and clutched her purse. "Mr. Carrigan, control your animal," the judge warned, voice sharp but calm. Noah didn't move. His expression didn't change. And still, Shadow kept walking. The bailiff stepped forward, unsure if he should intervene. The silence in the room was no longer neutral. It was taut, stretched thin with expectation. David Renner stiffened in the chair, his confidence cracking. His mouth twitched, his shoulders rose, unconsciously pulling back. Shadow stopped 2 feet from him, head level, tail still, eyes never leaving the man's face. Then just one bark. Short, deep, sharp. The kind of bark that echoed. Renner flinched hard. His hands jerked upward. The movement dislodged something in his coat pocket. Shadow sniffed then, with a swift, practiced motion, nudged open the side of the jacket. A small object tumbled out and clattered against the floor. Plastic, small, red-stained. A child's toy keychain, shaped like a cartoon dinosaur. A jagged edge of its broken tail was smeared with something dark and dried. Blood? Paint? No one could tell in the moment. But everyone saw it. The room went still. The judge slowly stood from her bench, eyes narrowing at the object. "What is that?" she asked evenly. Renner's voice wavered. I don't know how that got there. It's not mine." Shadow stepped back, sat down beside the toy, and turned his head to look directly at Noah. The room didn't breathe. Noah held his composure, but his eyes just briefly closed, then opened. A nod, almost imperceptible. The judge pointed to the bailiff. "Get that tested. Now." She then turned to the courtroom. "We're calling a recess. Immediately." Murmurs erupted. A few stood. Cameras flashed. One juror sat stunned, mouth slightly open. But amid the whirlwind, Shadow simply returned to Noah's side and laid back down, like nothing extraordinary had happened at all. Noah placed one hand on the dog's back. No words, no thanks, just touch. And the world finally began to question everything it thought it knew. The desert wind in Helmand didn't whisper, it scraped. Fine grains of sand slashed across the face like shrapnel, clinging to the sweat on skin, settling into every crease of every boot, every weapon, every soul. By mid-afternoon, the sun sat like a silent executioner overhead, and the compound walls, once beige, were caked in a reddish film, the color of old wounds. Sergeant Noah Carrigan, then 29 and still standing tall in his uniform, adjusted the strap of his rifle and gave a sharp signal with his hand, a silent flick, a glance to the left. His squad fanned out instinctively, clearing the courtyard with the kind of precision that only comes from repetition and necessity. Behind him, padding low and quiet like a shadow cast by memory itself, came the dog, Shadow, sleek, lean, alert. He moved ahead of the team with a tension that hummed through his frame. His ears twitched with each shift in wind, each creak of a loose door, each sound that didn't belong in a place like this. His black and tan coat was mottled with sweat and dirt, but his eyes were sharp-focused not on people, but on possibilities. Buried wires, pressure plates. Death in disguise. Noah trusted that dog more than he trusted most men, and Shadow had earned it. "Compound Bravo cleared," someone called from a corner. The team relaxed slightly. The kind of relax that isn't real, the kind that lets you breathe for 5 seconds before hell reminds you it's still awake. Noah gave a short nod. "Shadow," he said back when speaking came easy. "Check the perimeter." Shadow moved without hesitation, nose down, tail low. Each step precise, each turn calculated. To the untrained eye, he might have looked like just another military K-9 doing a routine sweep. But to those who watched closely, his handler especially, there was something more. A pause here, a double sniff there, a stiffening of the legs, a subtle change in breathing. Something was wrong. Noah saw it a heartbeat before the others. "Back!" he shouted, his voice like stone striking steel. "Shadow mark." Shadow gave one short bark and dropped instantly, crouching low. The blast came a second later. A roar tore through the afternoon like a god screaming. The ground split. Dust swallowed the sun. The shockwave hurled Noah backward, spine snapping against a concrete wall. His rifle clattered somewhere unseen. Then nothing. No words, no light. Just a sound that rang through bone. When his eyes opened, all he saw was red dust spinning in the wind and a world tilted sideways. He couldn't move his legs, couldn't feel them, couldn't call out. His throat burned like it was full of needles. Something warm and thick ran down the side of his neck. He thought he might be dying. Then a paw, dragging. Shadow was crawling toward him, one leg twisted, his left eye swollen shut, blood dripping from his muzzle. But he moved. God, he moved, 1 inch at a time. His body trembling, whimper barely audible, but his eyes, his good eye locked on Noah. He didn't care about the pain. He didn't wait for orders. He just came, because that's what Shadow did. They were both medevaced out together, side by side, on the same chopper, 2 soldiers broken in different ways. In the hospital, days passed in silence. Noah woke to tubes in his throat, monitors beeping steadily, and the cold knowledge that something was gone. Not just movement, but sound. His voice, once used to call out commands, to steady men under fire, was barely more than a fractured rasp. Shrapnel had torn through the side of his neck. The surgeons saved his life, but not his words. He remembered trying to speak the dog's name, remembered the sting of not being able to, the helplessness. "Shadow," he whispered, once barely audible. No one heard, but Shadow did, even bandaged, eye covered, one leg in a cast. He looked up from the kennel across the hallway in the military vet hospital and wagged his tail just once. Noah cried that night quietly into a pillow that smelled like antiseptic and sand. They were both changed, both scarred. Shadow would lose his depth perception forever. Noah would never walk again, and the voice that once commanded rooms would forever come in pieces, if at all. But what mattered, what survived, was something stronger than training, something forged in fire, a bond beyond speech, a soldier and his dog. The apartment sat at the end of a forgotten cul-de-sac, tucked between chain-link fences and weeping satellite dishes, just far enough from downtown Pittsburgh to feel isolated, but close enough for the city's hum to leak in at night like a distant heartbeat. It was a ground-floor unit in a low-rent building with cracked pavement out front and a porch light that flickered like it couldn't decide if it was alive or not. Noah Carrigan rolled through the threshold on a rainy Thursday afternoon. There was no banner, no one waiting, no yellow ribbons on the mailbox. Just silence. The air inside smelled like old paint and something chemical cleaner, maybe, or mildew that had given up. The walls were white, bare. His bags had arrived earlier, dumped by a van service contracted through the VA. A single box, labeled Carrigan Personal, sat unopened on the kitchen counter. His wheelchair's tires clicked faintly over the laminate flooring. He paused by the living room window. Rain traced thin rivers down the glass. Somewhere beyond it, a dog barked. Distant, feral. Noah closed his eyes. In his dreams, when he could sleep, there were no quiet apartments. Only dust, gunfire, the weight of Shadow's paw on his chest. Now there was just this, a small, sterile room, and the echo of a man who used to walk into danger without flinching, now struggling to roll across 8 feet of floor. The hardest part wasn't the chair. It wasn't even the voice that no longer came when he needed it most. It was the silence that lived inside him. That, and the absence of a sound he had come to depend on more than his own breath. The rhythmic tap of paws beside him. Shadow wasn't there. Not yet. He had asked, of course. The moment he was stable enough to read, Noah had scrawled a note on a whiteboard and shoved it in the face of his case manager. "Where's the dog?" Shadow had survived the blast, barely. The medics said it was a miracle. His left eye was gone. Scar tissue mapped his ribs like a second skin. But he'd made it through, and now the Army was preparing to retire him. Noah didn't waste time. He filed request after request, letters, appeals, personal statements, medical clearances. Rejections came first, then a pending review, then silence. He kept pushing. Because what the system saw as a half-blind aging liability, Noah saw as the only thing tethering him to the version of himself that hadn't completely unraveled. At night, the apartment pulsed with nightmares. The bed went unused. Noah slept in the chair most nights, not out of necessity, but habit. Flat surfaces made him feel exposed. He'd jolt awake at 3 a.m., drenched in sweat, eyes darting toward a corner that should have been occupied by a dog curled up like a soldier off duty. But it wasn't. Until one morning, after 6 weeks of dead air, the knock came. He rolled to the door slowly, heart pounding in his throat. A clipboard, a man in uniform, and behind him, on a short leash, thinner than Noah remembered, fur dulled by medication and travel fatigue, stood Shadow. Their eyes met. The world fell still. Noah didn't speak. He couldn't. But Shadow didn't need words. He pulled gently against the leash, and the man holding it handed it over without ceremony. "Clearance came through," the officer said. "They said you fought harder for this than most guys fight to walk again." Noah barely heard him. His hand reached out trembling to rest on Shadow's head. Shadow leaned in. That was all. They didn't embrace. They didn't cry. They just existed in the same space again. Two bodies with too many scars and a bond stronger than any voice. Inside the apartment, Shadow sniffed the walls, found the corner by the foot of the couch, and lay down with a heavy sigh that sounded more like memory than exhaustion. Noah rolled into the kitchen, opened the cabinet, and pulled out the only thing he had bought the day after moving in. A dog bowl. He filled it with water, set it down. Shadow didn't move right away. Then slowly he rose, limped over, and drank. That sound, the steady lapping of water, the clink of metal on tile, filled the apartment in a way Noah hadn't expected. It was the first sound of life that didn't make him flinch. Later that night, when the wind tapped against the window and the ghosts stirred like they always did, Noah reached down. His hand found Shadow's fur, and for the first time in months, the silence didn't feel so heavy. It felt like home. Recovery didn't come in waves, it came in inches. For Noah Carrigan, every day started the same. The hum of fluorescent lights in the VA rehab center, the scratch of Velcro straps tightening around his legs, and the low whistle of effort escaping his lips. Not a sound of exertion, but the only kind of voice his damaged vocal cords could still manage consistently. The physical therapy room smelled of antiseptic, sweat, and stale coffee. It was filled with men and women who bore injuries both visible and invisible. Some cracked jokes, some stared blankly at the walls. Others just showed up because the alternative was to stop moving altogether. Noah never joked. He just worked, quietly, relentlessly, and always Shadow beside him. The German shepherd walked at a steady pace, his gait uneven from the lingering injury to his hind leg, but his focus unbroken. He knew the halls by now, the corners, the elevators, the slope of the entry ramp outside. But more than that, he knew Noah's rhythms. When Noah's grip faltered during chair-to-table transfers, Shadow positioned himself at just the right angle, allowing Noah to brace a palm against his shoulder. When Noah's breath caught midway through speech therapy frustration rising in the silence, Shadow would lay his head gently in his lap until the storm passed. One morning, during a particularly slow set of assisted lifts, the therapist had smiled and said, "I don't know who's rehabbing who anymore." Noah managed a breath of something like laughter, thin and hoarse, but real. It started with gestures, not the kind they taught in military manuals, not halt or clear left. These were born out of trial, error, and a shared need to speak without speaking. A tap of two fingers against the thigh. Wait. A curl of the hand near the shoulder. Come closer. A twitch in the brow or shift in breath. I'm not okay, but don't draw attention. Shadow learned quickly, quicker than anyone had expected. Maybe because he was already trained in dozens of cues. Maybe because the man he followed had once commanded fire teams with nothing but hand signs and grit. Or maybe it was just what love does when language fails. They refined it slowly, in the apartment, on walks, in the clinic. Each signal was built on trust, then repetition. Eventually, even therapists and nurses began to understand them. When Shadow stood and turned toward the hallway, they knew Noah needed a break. When he sat stiff and alert beside the therapy bench, they knew to stop pushing him. But it wasn't just task and response. There were subtler moments, too. When Noah's nightmares grew claws and dragged him into old memories, Shadow would leap onto the bed before he could even cry out, because he never did. Shadow knew from the way Noah's fists clenched or the way his breathing spiked. He would press his body against the man's chest, anchoring him like weight against a rising tide. No words, just pressure, presence, memory. And when Noah began speech therapy in earnest, voice trembling on consonants that refused to form, it was Shadow who gave him the courage to try. One day, the therapist held up a picture of a dog and asked gently, "Who's this?" Noah's hand trembled as he reached for the whiteboard to write it, but instead he surprised them both. A whisper dry and strained escaped. "Shad... Ow!" Shadow lifted his head, ears perking at the sound of his name. His tail thumped once against the floor. The therapist froze, then smiled. "That counts," she said softly. "That more than counts." Noah didn't smile back. He just looked at the dog, something welling behind his tired eyes that said what his mouth couldn't. "You brought me back." In the months that followed, Shadow wasn't just a companion. He became a lifeline, a quiet bridge between Noah and the world he no longer knew how to walk into. He fetched dropped keys before they hit the ground, pressed the emergency call button when Noah had a seizure scare in the shower, nudged his knee during group therapy when the tension in Noah's shoulders rose just a bit too high. He became a buffer in public, positioning himself between Noah's chair and crowds, guiding him through intersections, leading him away when conversations became too loud, too fast, too full of pity. And above all, Shadow never made him explain. Some days, that was the only reason Noah could leave the apartment. One afternoon, they sat in the local park, not to socialize, not to heal, just to exist. The sun was low. A child passed on a scooter and pointed. "Mom, that man's dog listens to his eyes." Noah looked down at Shadow. Shadow looked up. No command was given. But in that quiet moment, it was understood. They didn't need words anymore. In a neighborhood where most people kept their heads down and minds on their own troubles, Noah Carrigan became a familiar figure, not because he tried to be, but because he was impossible to ignore in his quiet way. It started small. A flat tire on a kid's bicycle left leaning against the curb. Noah spotted it during one of his early morning rolls with Shadow. Those hour-long circuits through cracked sidewalks and uneven alleys that passed for exercise and sanity. The boy, maybe 8 or 9, stood a few feet away, watching with uncertainty as Noah slowed beside the bike. Shadow sniffed at it curiously. Without saying a word, Noah rolled closer, examined the tire, then motioned gently to the boy, 2 fingers pointing to the garage across the street. 5 minutes later, the kid watched, wide-eyed, as Noah pulled a small hand pump from his backpack, patched the rubber, and spun the wheel until it turned smooth again. When he finished, he gave the boy a thumbs up. The kid blinked, then looked down at Shadow. The dog sat patiently, tail wagging once, slow and steady. "Thank you, mister," the boy whispered. Noah nodded. He didn't say it, but it was heard. Word spread slowly, like it always does when kindness isn't loud. People began to notice the man in the wheelchair with the service dog who fixed broken fences without being asked, who left a pair of worn but polished combat boots by the homeless shelter's back door, who replaced the batteries in Mrs. Del Vecchio's smoke detectors without a sound, who shoveled the walkway outside the corner bodega before dawn, then rolled away before anyone could see who did it. They started calling him the Silent Marine. The kids called Shadow the Ghost Dog, partly because he moved like a shadow, partly because no one ever heard him bark, and partly because he always seemed to show up exactly when needed. Sometimes Noah would sit with his coffee on the porch, and strangers' neighbors now would pass by, offer a nod, and say things like, "Appreciate what you did for that kid," or, "You and your boy there, you're good people." He never responded aloud. He'd just raise a hand, 2 fingers lifted slightly, and Shadow would lift his head in turn, like punctuation at the end of an unspoken sentence. Noah didn't need credit, didn't want attention. He just couldn't not help. One afternoon, A woman from 3 doors down knocked on his apartment door. She held out a casserole dish, eyes soft but cautious. "You probably don't eat casseroles," she said, almost apologetically. But it felt wrong not to say thank you. Noah took the dish with both hands, gave a short nod. Shadow sat at his heel, tilting his head slightly as if studying her sincerity. As she turned to go, she paused. "I know you probably get tired of hearing it," she added quietly, "but thank you for what you gave." Noah blinked slowly. Not out of sadness, not quite. Just weight, the kind that memory leaves behind. He didn't speak, but his hand dropped to Shadow's neck, fingers curling into the fur gently. The woman understood, and that was enough. Their bond, already deepened by war and recovery, began to take on something wordless, primal, unshakable. Shadow knew when Noah was lying about being okay. He would stand guard by the door when Noah's breathing shifted just slightly after watching a war documentary. He'd nudge Noah's shoulder at 3 a.m. when the night tremors got too rough, pressing his weight across his chest like a living blanket. And sometimes, just sometimes, when Noah wheeled out to the edge of the park and stared at the tree line for a little too long, Shadow would step into his line of sight. No bark, no whimper, just presence. A reminder, still here, still yours, still enough. That fall, someone painted a mural on the back of the local community center. It was simple. Black and tan brushstrokes outlined a service dog sitting beside a man in a wheelchair beneath a rising sun. At the bottom, in faint script, it read, "Some heroes don't speak, they stay." Noah never asked who painted it. He didn't need to. The street was asleep. Outside, the air hung thick with early autumn stillness. Porch lights flickered behind blinds. Lawns lay empty, half-cut and forgotten. The distant hum of the city had faded beneath a blanket of crickets and the occasional soft rustle of leaves brushing against siding. It was the kind of quiet that didn't feel earned, but temporary, like something was waiting to interrupt it. Inside apartment 1A, Noah Carrigan sat in his wheelchair by the window, the room lit only by the blue haze of a muted TV. He wasn't watching. He rarely did. The screen played an old nature documentary about wolves and migration background noise to fill the space where memories tried to crawl in. Shadow lay curled at his feet, chest rising in slow, steady rhythm. Noah sipped lukewarm coffee from a chipped mug. His body didn't feel tired, but the ache behind his ribs told a different story. Another night without sleep. Another night in the quiet that had become his normal. And then, without warning, Shadow lifted his head. No growl at first. Just emotion, sudden, intent. His ears perked, stiff and forward. Muscles tightened beneath his coat. His nose twitched once. Twice. Then came the sound. A low, guttural rumble from deep in his throat. Controlled, but alert. Noah looked down sharply. Shadow rarely growled, almost never inside the apartment. His training, his instinct had long since filtered real threats from background noise. For him to react like this, Noah's fingers reached toward the window lock, twisting it open with practiced ease. The window creaked as it slid up. A gust of night air crept in, damp, still warm from the afternoon sun. At first there was nothing, just the hum of a nearby transformer, a flickering porch light 2 doors down, the faint rattle of wind nudging a loose trash can lid. Then he heard it, a cry, barely audible, but unmistakable. A child's sob, muffled, uneven, broken into hiccuped gasps. It wasn't the kind of cry that demanded attention. It was the kind born from repetition, familiarity, pain wrapped in silence. It came from the house next door. Noah froze. His apartment shared a wall with Unit 1BA single-story rental with faded green siding and a crooked fence. A young couple had moved in 2 weeks ago. He hadn't spoken to them, just a nod at the mailbox, a wave when the woman dropped a bag of groceries, and once a glance through the curtain catching the small shape of a boy standing barefoot in the backyard, staring at nothing. Now that same child was crying, not the kind of cry that came from a nightmare or a skinned knee. This was wet with something deeper. Wounds that didn't leave bruises you could see from the street. Shadow growled again, barely louder than before, but sharper this time, focused. His gaze locked toward the wall, toward where the sobs had come from. Noah leaned forward and grabbed the security tablet from the windowsill. Months ago, he had installed a small outdoor camera pointed toward the narrow alley between the two houses, a habit from his military days. He rarely checked it. Tonight, he did. The screen came to life in static gray light. The infrared picked up 2 figures' shadows moving fast and uneven across the side path of 1B. A man, tall and broad, gripping something small. A boy, dragging him by the arm toward the back door. No struggle, no shouting, just the mechanical tug of force and fear. Then, just before the door closed, a slap. Hard. Sudden. The boy staggered. Noah's breath caught. His hand moved to the phone. He typed quickly, voice useless as ever. 911. The dispatcher answered with a crisp voice. Emergency services. What's your emergency? He tapped into the voice-to-text app, pressed play. Suspected child abuse next door. Camera footage, ongoing, immediate. Do you have visual confirmation of physical harm, sir? The dispatcher asked. He rewound the footage, played it again, showed the slap. Yes, he typed, but shadowed, night vision only, no color. The line crackled. I understand your concern, but without a clearer visual or audible threat, protocol requires us to file and follow up. Unless the child is in immediate danger, he is, Noah typed, hands shaking. I'm sorry, sir. We'll dispatch a social worker within the next 48 hours to assess. Noah ended the call. The silence that followed felt different. Not peaceful, not reflective, complicit. Shadow let out a short, sharp breath through his nose as if sensing the same knot rising in his handler's chest. Noah sat frozen at the window, watching the dark house next door. Inside that box of wood and walls, someone small had just cried himself to sleep, and no one else had heard. But he had, and Shadow had too. The security camera feed flickered in grainy black and white, infrared sensors washing the alley in an eerie glow. The timestamp blinked in the upper corner 02:11 a.m. Noah Carrigan leaned closer to the screen, his fingers stiff with tension as he replayed the footage for the 3rd time. The footage wasn't long, 12 seconds at most, but it was enough to make his stomach twist. A man's silhouette, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the confidence of someone who believed no one was watching, grabbed a smaller figure by the wrist and yanked. The child stumbled, resisted instinctively, but the resistance was weak, like a reaction born not of defiance, but habit, a defense that had been punished too many times before. Noah paused the video at the exact moment the slap came. The child's head jerked sideways, hair flying in the air like punctuation. No sound, just the stark, sickening motion. Then the boy disappeared into the dark doorway. Noah's jaw clenched. A tendon in his neck pulsed visibly beneath scarred skin. His hand trembled as he reached again for his phone. Shadow, who had been sitting silently at his side, shifted his weight and let out a low exhale, as if reading the storm building in his handler's chest. The phone lit up with the 911 prompt. Noah tapped the voice-to-text app, his fingers no longer steady. Child abuse. Visible on camera. Just happened. Next door, Unit 1B. The dispatcher's voice came through after a few rings. Calm, measured, mechanical. 911 Emergency Services. What's your location? He typed and sent it. Added another note. Live camera feed available. Physical harm observed. There was a pause, static on the line. Sir, do you have a clear visual showing injury or identifiable abuse? Noah's thumbs moved quickly. Infrared footage, night vision. It's there. The child is struck, dragged, recorded. Can you confirm the identity of the adult? Noah hesitated. He couldn't. New neighbor. No full name, tall male, light jacket, dragging small boy, crying heard before. Another pause, then the words came. Words he somehow already knew would come. I'm sorry, sir, but without clear daytime visuals or audio confirming distress, we cannot classify this as an immediate danger situation. His pulse throbbed in his temple. Immediate danger? What did they think this was? The boy's in danger now. I understand, sir. We can file an official report with Child Protective Services, and they'll conduct a follow-up visit within 24 to 48 hours. If you witness an active assault, or if you have a recording with identifiable faces or voices, we may be able to dispatch officers sooner. Noah's thumb hovered over the reply field. He didn't type anything. He just stared at the screen, at the blurred image of a small boy being dragged through a door, at the absence of resistance, at the silence. He ended the call. The weight of inaction sat on his chest like sandbags in a firefight. All his life, Noah had been trained to respond, to act fast, protect the vulnerable, eliminate the threat. But here, in the suburbs, behind drywall and legal protocol, his hands were tied by policies that couldn't see bruises in the dark. He set the phone down. Shadow stepped forward and placed his head gently on Noah's knee, eyes lifted, not questioning, but anchoring. Noah leaned forward and replayed the footage again. Slower this time. He paused it at the slap. Then he zoomed in, trying to make out any more detail. The man's face was turned away. The boy's outline barely registered under the infrared haze. No blood, no scream, just motion, just fear, just everything that lived between the frames. And it wasn't enough. He looked out the window toward the neighbor's house. The porch light was off. The windows were drawn. But Noah didn't need to see inside to know that on the other side of those walls a child had gone to bed, not with a bedtime story, but with a swollen cheek and the taste of fear in his mouth. Noah stared into the dark and made himself a quiet promise. If no one else will see this, then I will. And if no one else will stop it, then I will. He turned to Shadow, who had not moved. Noah placed a hand on the dog's back, and they sat there, man and dog, watching the screen, waiting, listening, breathing the kind of breath that comes not from panic, but preparation. Because sometimes you don't need a uniform to fight, just a pair of eyes that refuse to look away. The knock wasn't loud. It was barely there, a hesitant tap-tap, followed by silence, the kind of knock that wasn't meant to wake someone, but to ask permission to exist. Noah Carrigan opened his eyes slowly. He hadn't slept. Not really, just drifted in and out of half-dreams, visions of dust and screams, and the grainy footage that played behind his eyes no matter how many times he blinked it away. Shadow was already awake, sitting alert by the door, head tilted. Another knock. Softer this time. Noah wheeled to the entrance, the early morning light slanting through the window in cold strips. He paused, hand hovering over the lock. He cracked the door, and there he was. A small boy, no more than 6, maybe 7, barefoot, shivering. His t-shirt hung crooked off one shoulder. There was a bruise forming across his cheekbone, ugly, fresh purple and green like a storm beneath the skin. His eyes were wide, but not teary. They were too dry, the kind that had learned not to cry too loudly. He didn't say a word. He just looked up at Noah, then past him, at Shadow. And before Noah could ask a single thing, the boy stepped forward, straight into the apartment, straight into the space where pain had lived. He moved like he wasn't asking for permission, like his body had decided before his mind did. Shadow stood still as stone as the boy approached, eyes soft but unflinching. The boy knelt, slowly, and without a sound wrapped his arms around the dog's neck. It wasn't a hug. It was something older, more desperate, as if the warmth of the animal might burn away what had been done. Shadow didn't move. He just leaned into it, head resting gently on the boy's shoulder. Tail unmoving, chest steady. Noah watched, unmoving. Then he wheeled back, opened the door wider. "Come in," he whispered, his voice rough, fragile, barely a thread of sound. The boy was already inside. Noah moved to the kitchen, pulled a clean glass from the cupboard and filled it with water. When he turned, the boy was still clinging to Shadow. "Hey," Noah said gently, kneeling beside him, his legs limp and useless, but his voice trying its best. "You're safe here." The boy didn't answer. Noah offered the glass. Tiny hands reached for it, trembling. He drank like someone who didn't know when the next drink might come. Afterward, Noah took a blanket from the couch and wrapped it around the boy's shoulders. It swallowed him whole. He didn't protest, just sat there on the rug, one hand still tangled in Shadow's fur, the other clutching the blanket tight against his body like armor. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was sacred. Noah grabbed his phone again, typed out a message to Child Protective Services. This time, he didn't rely on footage. He didn't rely on procedure. Child walked into my apartment this morning. Visible bruising, barefoot, refusing to speak. I'm calling it in. He's here. He's safe. Please come. Now. He pressed send, then sat beside them. He didn't ask the boy's name, didn't ask what had happened. He didn't need to. The body tells its own story, the silence, too. Shadow shifted slightly, letting out a soft chuff of breath. The boy, still mute, turned and nestled into the dog's side. Noah reached out and placed a hand on Shadow's back. "Good boy," he whispered. But in that moment he wasn't just talking to the dog. He was talking to the boy, too. And to himself. Because something had shifted. The child had come not to escape. He had come to choose, to walk away from pain and toward something that felt like safety, even if he didn't yet have the words for it, and in a world that had failed to protect him, in a night filled with locked doors and protocol. This one had opened. The morning had just begun to soften. A pale, overcast sun hung behind the clouds like a withheld promise, casting a dim light through the blinds of apartment 1A. Inside, everything was still. The boy, still nameless, slept curled on the couch, wrapped in the same blanket Noah had given him, one small hand resting protectively on Shadow's side. The dog had stayed beside him all night, barely moving, only adjusting his weight when the child stirred from dreams that still left him whimpering. Noah sat at the dining table watching. One hand held a notepad, lists of questions he planned to ask the CPS officer due to arrive that morning. His pen moved slowly, silently, as if writing them down would somehow make the process easier. It wouldn't. His body was tired, his mind sharp. He hadn't slept again. But this time it wasn't the kind of fatigue born from nightmares. It was vigilance, the kind of bone-deep awareness drilled into him by years of war zones and wrong doors. The kind that knows peace never lasts, not when monsters still know your address. And then it happened. A bang, the sound of a fist pounding against the front door. 3 quick slams, violent, determined. Shadow's head snapped up, ears rigid. The boy jolted upright in terror, eyes wide, instinctively pulling the blanket over his face like it could make him invisible. Another bang louder, and then a voice shouting through the door. "You think you can take my son from me? You think this is your call?" The words punched the air. Noah's stomach dropped. He rolled forward fast. But fast wasn't enough. Not with wheels, not with scar tissue for legs. He reached the door just as the handle rattled, then slammed again under the weight of a boot. Shadow had already moved. He positioned himself between Noah and the door, teeth bared, body coiled low and tight like a spring held by instinct. Bang! Another hit. The frame groaned. Noah turned to the boy, pointed toward the bathroom, his hand forming a sharp signal. "Go! Now!" The boy hesitated, paralyzed by fear. Another crash. Noah gave the signal again, faster, firmer. This time the child obeyed, stumbling off the couch and scrambling down the hall, door shutting behind him just as the lock gave way. The front door exploded open. The man filled the threshold wild-eyed, face red with fury, voice cracked from rage and alcohol. "You've got 10 seconds to give him back, or I'll take him myself." Noah's voice, what was left of it, caught in his throat. He tried to speak, but it came out broken, a rasp that the man ignored entirely. He rolled forward, trying to block the path with his chair. "You need to leave." But the man was already moving. "I don't care what your sob story is," he barked, stepping inside, fists clenched. "You think having a dog makes you a hero? You don't get to keep what's mine." He lunged. Noah jerked the chair to turn, but he wasn't fast enough. Then Shadow moved. A blur of black and tan launched from Noah's side, intercepting the man with the precision of a missile. The growl came first, low and rising, like thunder before the strike. Then the bark, a single explosive burst that shook the air. The man shouted in surprise and threw up his arms. But it was too late. Shadow's teeth clamped down, not to destroy, but to halt. His jaws locked on the man's forearm, holding, not mauling, anchoring the threat in place like a trap forged of bone and justice. The man screamed and twisted, but Shadow held his ground, unmoved by panic, unmoved by sound. It was a controlled grip, measured, enough to stop him, not enough to scar. "Call him off!" the man shrieked, buckling to his knees. Noah finally found breath. His fingers moved 2 quick gestures, one high, one low. Shadow released. The man fell backward onto the floor, cradling his arm. And that's when the door burst open again, this time not with fury, but authority. 2 CPS officers and a security escort rushed in, eyes darting, hands extended, ready to intervene. They stopped when they saw the scene. Shadow standing still as a statue, chest heaving, eyes locked on the intruder. Noah sitting rigid in his chair, hand still raised in silent command. And the man curled on the floor, defeated, panting, trying to form words that had lost their power. One of the officers knelt beside him. "Sir, you're under investigation for child endangerment. You just broke into a protected residence and assaulted a disabled veteran." But he kidnapped my son," the man stammered. "No," the CPS worker cut in, pointing toward the hallway, where the child now stood in the shadows, watching. The boy stepped forward, not running, not crying, just watching. And for the first time, the fear in his eyes was not for the man on the floor, but for what might happen if Shadow hadn't been there. The man's shadow hit the floor before he did. One leg over the threshold, one arm swinging, rage blindfolding reason. He came fast, too fast. Noah knew the second he saw that look, wild, unfocused nostrils flaring like a charging bull, that he wouldn't have time to get between him and the child. Not in a wheelchair, not in this body. But he didn't have to. Shadow did what he was born for. In a blur of instinct and muscle, the dog launched from Noah's side like a thunderbolt cracking through silence. His growl was no longer a warning. It was a barrier made of sound, the kind that reached bone before it reached ears. The man's eyes widened, but it was too late. Shadow slammed into him, front paws striking high across the chest, his teeth locking around the attacker's forearm with trained precision. Not the throat, not the legs, just enough to control, disable, stop. The man's scream was sharp, guttural, born more of fear than pain. He stumbled backward, crashing against the wall near the doorframe, struggling to wrench free. Noah didn't move. He couldn't. All he could do was watch heart thudding in his throat as Shadow held his ground, legs planted, eyes narrowed, breathing steady. It wasn't violence. It was discipline. Years of it. A lifetime's worth in one moment. The boy peeked around the hallway corner, clutching the blanket. His small frame was trembling, but his eyes were locked on Shadow. And for the first time, the child wasn't afraid of what came next. "Get this dog off me!" the man screamed, trying to pull away, his voice cracking under pressure. But Shadow didn't budge. His grip was firm but clean. No tearing, no blood, just containment. Noah raised his right hand, fingers forming the shape that only one being on earth understood without question. A soft flick of the wrist, a downward angle. Release. Shadow let go. The man stumbled to the floor, gasping, holding his arm like he'd been shot instead of stopped. "You're dead," he hissed at Noah, pointing a shaking finger. "You and that damn mutt." The words died in his mouth as another voice cut through the chaos. "Sir, step away from the veteran and place your hands where we can see them." Two CPS agents and one uniformed officer entered like a controlled wave, weapons holstered but posture hard. The woman in front, short and steel-eyed, surveyed the room in 3 seconds flat. One child in the hallway, still frozen. One man in a wheelchair, breathing hard. One dog calm, poised, watching. One intruder on the ground, shaking, trying to reclaim control he'd just lost. The officer moved first, stepping over the threshold. "Name?" Daniel Renner," the man said between breaths. "Hands behind your head. Now." He didn't argue this time. Cuffs clicked into place. The CPS worker knelt beside the boy, her voice gentle but clear. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" He nodded slowly, eyes never leaving Shadow. She followed his gaze, then looked back at Noah. "You trained him?" Noah said nothing. His throat felt like gravel. He simply raised a hand and signed the words, "He trained me." She understood. More than that, she believed it. As the officers led the man away, he shouted over his shoulder, voice splintered with panic. "You don't know what that boy's told him? He's lying. He's confused. This is all a mistake." Shadow growled once, low and final. The man shut up. Outside, the flashing lights from the CPS vehicle turned the sidewalk into a swirl of red and blue. Neighbors peeked through blinds. Some stood on porches in silence. The quiet street that had learned to mind its own business now stared at something it could no longer ignore. Back inside, the apartment held its breath. Shadow walked over to the boy and sat down slowly, deliberately. The boy reached forward and placed both hands on his fur. Still no words, but he didn't need them, because when the world tried to break through that door with fists and fury, a bark had answered, and it had been enough. The story should have ended there. A child rescued, an abuser in handcuffs, a dog doing what he was trained to do. A man who, though battered by war and loss, stood up silently for someone smaller than him. But stories rarely end where they should. The next morning, the headlines came. Local news anchors led with phrases like, "Disabled veteran accused of assault," and "Service dog attacks civilian during custody dispute." Photos of Noah's face taken from old military records were splashed across TV screens and news sites, cropped to show only the hard angles of his jaw, the shadows under his eyes. They chose the version of him that looked least human, most broken. They never showed the boy. They never mentioned the bruises. And when they did show Shadow, it was in freeze frames that made him look like a weapon, not a protector, not a lifeline, just a dog with bared teeth. Daniel Renier, now suddenly calm and composed, spoke to cameras outside the police station with a bandage wrapped neatly around his forearm. "I don't blame the man," he said, shaking his head as if pitying Noah. "PTSD is a serious thing, but letting a combat dog loose on a parent, that's not defense, that's trauma turned violent." He called himself a concerned father. He called Shadow a military-grade threat. He called Noah unstable. And people listened, because lies, when wrapped in suits and sound bites, travel faster than truth. Within 48 hours, Noah's name trended locally on social media. Some called him a hero, others called him dangerous. Some offered donations. Others left comments like, "Another veteran snapped. Should have been institutionalized. That dog needs to be put down before someone else gets hurt." Noah read none of it, but his neighbors did. And slowly, the nods stopped. The glances turned colder. The porch across the street that used to wave now closed its blinds. The woman who once brought him casserole now looked away when they passed in the parking lot. Fear always echoes louder than facts. The charges came 3 days later. Official notice. Hand-delivered. Criminal trespass. Endangerment of a minor. Use of a dangerous animal to cause bodily harm. Noah read the letter alone, seated at his kitchen table, Shadow lying beside him like a statue made of breath and loyalty. He didn't rage. He didn't cry. He just exhaled, folded the paper, and placed it on the table like a document from a war zone he thought he'd left behind. Shadow looked up, eyes calm but alert, reading something in Noah's body that no human would have seen. Noah placed his hand on the dog's neck, fingers gently tracing the line of scar tissue behind his ear. A conversation without words passed between them. "We've been through worse. We'll go through this too." Calls came in from reporters, emails from bloggers. One even left a voicemail offering a 5-figure payment for an exclusive interview. Noah deleted them all. He didn't want the spotlight. He didn't want to fight on camera. He just wanted the truth to breathe. And truth, he knew, didn't always roar. Sometimes it sat quietly on the living room floor, curled at your feet, waiting for the moment the world remembered how to listen. That evening, as another segment played on the television, blaring footage of Shadow lunging toward a blurry figure with a red circle drawn around his teeth, Noah muted the screen. He rolled toward the front window and looked out across the yard. The boy's footprints from that morning still lingered in the dew-stained grass. Small, bare, faint, but real. He reached down, and Shadow placed his head in Noah's lap. Together they sat in silence. The world could twist the story, could paint him as dangerous, frame the dog as a threat, rebrand justice as disorder. But inside that apartment was the truth. Still, breathing, loyal, waiting. The courthouse steps felt like a stage. Cameras lined the sidewalks. Tripods perched like rifles on patrol. Microphones angled for ambush. Reporters spoke in hushed tones until red lights blinked on, and then the shouting began. "Mr. Carrigan, do you regret releasing the dog? Did you plan the incident? Are you fit to be in the community?" Noah didn't answer. He rolled forward in silence, head high, expression unreadable. Shadow walked beside him, steady as ever, unmoved by the crowd, the chaos, the swirl of voices trying to poke holes in something they didn't understand. His vest was plain, no slogans, no badge, just a small patch stitched near the shoulder. Service dog, do not pet. Retired canine, combat trained. To the cameras, it might have looked like a warning. To Noah, it was the only truth they couldn't twist. Inside the courtroom, the air felt colder than it should have. Every fluorescent light buzzed just a little louder. Every whisper sounded rehearsed. The bailiff eyed Shadow like a grenade with a heartbeat. Noah's attorney, young, underpaid, and already sweating, adjusted his tie and leaned in. "They're painting you as aggressive. They say you let Shadow loose, that you escalated. I tried filing for dismissal, but—" He didn't finish. He didn't need to. The prosecution was already at work. On the wall-mounted television above the jury box, a video clip began to play. The footage, grainy and jittery, showed the exact moment Shadow leapt forward. No audio. Just a slowed-down image of teeth and motion, repeated frame by frame like a predator caught mid-strike. "There," the prosecutor said, pointing with a laser pen. "That's not a service animal reacting to a command. That's a weapon unleashed." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor turned toward the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are not here to undermine Mr. Carrigan's service to this country. We respect that. We honor it. But trauma, even unintentional, does not excuse recklessness. He brought military tactics into a civilian neighborhood. He trespassed, interfered with a domestic matter, and allowed a dangerous animal to inflict bodily harm on an unarmed man." She gestured toward the defense table. "Mr. Carrigan is not a villain. He is a man deeply broken by war. But that does not make him a hero." Noah stared straight ahead, not flinching, not reacting. But inside, every word pierced like shrapnel. Shadow sat at his heel, unmoving. Noah's fingers drifted toward the dog's shoulder, brushing against the patchwork of scar tissue beneath his fur. It was the same patch Shadow had once used to brace against a roadside wall, seconds before an IED changed both their lives. Now it was just flesh, wounded, but still there. In the back of the courtroom, someone shifted. A woman in a beige blazer from CPS sat with her arms crossed. Next to her, A small boy with dark, tired eyes clutched a stuffed dinosaur faded green, missing one eye, the fabric worn at the seams. He hadn't spoken, not once, since arriving at the foster care unit. The trauma response was severe, the caseworker had said. He only communicated in nods and silence. The prosecutor referenced that, too. Even the child hasn't said Mr. Carrigan did anything helpful. There's no official statement, no recorded testimony. Just a frightened boy and a man with a history of combat training and a dog with military teeth. It was said casually, deliberately, like calling a heart a pump or a hero a hazard. Noah's attorney stood to object but stumbled over his words. Objection assumes the child's silence as proof of absence. The judge raised an eyebrow. Sustained. But the damage had been done. The jury had heard what they needed to hear. And in a room where words were weapons, Noah had none to fire back. The judge called for recess. The gavel struck like a reminder. This wasn't war. This was court. And here, silence didn't mean strength. It meant suspicion. Outside in the hallway, Noah sat by the window, sunlight catching on the dull gray rim of his wheelchair. Shadow lay beside him, chin on his paws, tail still. The CPS worker approached, pausing a few feet away. She looked down at the boy beside her. "Do you want to tell him anything?" she asked gently. The boy looked up, then at Shadow, then back at the hallway floor. He said nothing, but his fingers reached out and brushed against the back of Shadow's ear so lightly it was almost missed. Shadow looked up, blinked once, then licked the boy's hand. The boy didn't flinch. He just leaned into him like he remembered what safety felt like. Noah watched. He didn't need a courtroom to know what was real. But in the world outside that hallway, truth without testimony was just a whisper, and whispers, in rooms built for shouting, were too easy to ignore. Her heels clicked too loud for a courtroom. Malene Renner stepped into the witness box wearing a pale blouse and a navy blazer that didn't quite sit right on her frame. She looked smaller than she had in the photos, a woman whose presence had once dominated the porch next door with scolding tones and sharp glances. But now, under oath and under scrutiny, she seemed to have shrunk in her seat. She took her oath with both hands clenched in her lap. Her voice didn't tremble, but it didn't breathe either. The prosecutor stood nearby, not aggressive, not loud, just gentle enough to guide her story. "Malene, can you tell us a bit about your family life before the incident?" She nodded. "My husband Daniel and I moved into the neighborhood 3 weeks before it happened. We were trying to start fresh. A new school for our son, a quieter community. And would you describe Daniel as a violent man?" A pause. Too long. Malene's lips parted, then closed again, then opened. "No," she said. He gets frustrated, like anyone, but he's not violent. Not intentionally." The courtroom was still. Noah watched from across the room, face unreadable. Shadow lay at his feet, head on his paws, his eyes trained on the woman, not hostile, not confused, just watching, as if he remembered something she didn't think anyone saw. The prosecutor continued, her tone sympathetic. "There have been reports that your son came to Mr. Carrigan's apartment bruised and afraid. Can you speak to that?" Malene shifted in her seat. Her hands twisted the edge of her sleeve. "He has accidents," she said. "He's clumsy. He falls. There's a lot of pressure on him with the move, and sometimes he acts out. Daniel tries to discipline him, but—" She trailed off. But it's never—" Abuse, not like they're saying. No one in the jury moved, but a few faces tightened. Still no one questioned her. Noah's attorney stood slowly. Mrs. Renner, is it true that your son has not spoken a word since the day he left your care? Yes. Do you know why? I don't, she answered almost too quickly. Is it true that your husband filed charges not immediately but after Child Protective Services removed the boy from your home? She blinked. I didn't handle the legal side. Daniel, he was angry. He felt like our son had been taken without due process. The attorney took a slow step forward. Was he angry at his son? Malene's fingers gripped the railing of the stand. No. Another pause. No, she said again. He was angry at the interference. He said, people should mind their business. She didn't look at Noah. Not once. From the gallery, the CPS worker glanced toward the boy seated beside her. The child was hugging the same faded dinosaur. His legs swung above the floor. He wasn't looking at his mother. He was looking at Shadow, and Shadow, still motionless, watched her. The cross-examination ended quickly. Malene's testimony had the shape of sincerity. The cadence, the costume. She said all the right things, she cried at all the right pauses. And the courtroom, already leaning toward doubt, tipped just a little more. As Malene stepped down from the witness stand, she walked past the defense table. Just for a second, her eyes flicked toward Noah. Not long enough to meet his gaze, but long enough for Shadow to rise slowly to his feet. No growl, no step forward. Just a shift, just pressure in the air. Malene paused mid-step. Her hand brushed against the inside of her coat reflexively. A nervous tick. Shadow's ears lifted, nose twitching. His body grew alert, not aggressive, but attentive, curious. Noah's eyes narrowed, subtle, sharp. Shadow leaned forward slightly and let out a low, questioning huff. The courtroom didn't notice, but Noah did. And so did the boy. As Malene left the stand, the prosecutor whispered something and gave her shoulder a gentle squeeze. She nodded. The moment she exited the room, the air shifted. Noah exhaled. Shadow sat down again, slowly. No words had been spoken to dispute her story, but something in the way her fingers clutched fabric, something in the way the dog stood, said everything that needed to be said. And it wasn't over. The courtroom had quieted, but not in peace. It was the kind of quiet that came after something had been swallowed, whole logic, empathy, maybe even justice. Malene Renner's testimony lingered in the air like perfume that didn't belong. Everything about it had been polished. Her hesitation rehearsed, her tears perfectly timed. She'd walked out with the jury leaning just a little further away from Noah Carrigan. And Shadow knew it. He hadn't taken his eyes off her, not once during the testimony, not as she passed the defense table, not even when she exited the witness box with downcast eyes and trembling fingers. Now she was seated quietly near the front row, a thin layer of dignity wrapped around her like a borrowed coat. She smoothed her lap over and over, pretending not to feel the weight of the dog's stare. The judge called for the next motion, and Noah moved, barely, just one hand, a flick of his fingers, sharp, downward, subtle, a signal. Shadow rose. The gallery barely noticed at first. They were too focused on the court clerk, too distracted by the rustle of shifting paper and the whispers of legal counsel. But then they saw him. Shadow, stepping out from behind the defense table, walked slowly, not in aggression, not in confusion, but with the quiet purpose of something ancient. something that had done this before, not in courtrooms, but in rubble, in ruins. His paws tapped against the tile in perfect rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. The sound echoed louder than voices. He approached Malene Renaer. She stiffened. "Is he?" she began to ask, but the words died in her throat. Shadow didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply stepped closer, head tilted. Then, with a movement so delicate it could have been mistaken for affection, he pressed his nose into the inside pocket of her coat. Malene jerked backward instinctively. "No, wait, I don't—" But it was too late. Shadow gently pulled something free. It dropped to the courtroom floor with a faint clink, a sound that landed like thunder in a cathedral. It was a child's necklace. Plastic, blue string, a small star-shaped charm cracked down the center. The string dotted in something dark, old, dried, blood. Gasps rose from the gallery, audible, sharp. Even the judge stood. "What is that?" Malene's lips parted. She looked at the object on the floor like it had crawled there from a nightmare. I don't know where that came from," she stammered. "It's not mine. I didn't—" Shadow sat beside the necklace, turned, and looked directly at Noah. Noah nodded once. The moment was surgical. From the back of the room, a child's voice broke the silence. "That's mine." Every head turned. The little boy seated beside the CPS worker stood up. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the courtroom like it had been waiting for the air to clear. "That's my necklace," he said again. He began to walk forward. "He broke it," the boy whispered, pointing at no one in particular. "My dad. He pulled it and it broke. And it hurt." Malene froze. Tears filled her eyes, then fell without warning. She dropped to her knees, not toward the boy, not toward the dog, but toward the weight that had finally broken the dam inside her. "I didn't know how to stop him," she whispered. "I didn't know what to do." Noah sat motionless. Shadow walked over to the boy and stood beside him. The boy reached down and gently rested his hand on Shadow's head, and the courtroom, for one impossible second, became still. The prosecutor scrambled to speak, rising from her seat. "Objection! This is emotional manipulation. The dog is being used to influence testimony." The judge cut her off with a raised hand, her voice calm but absolute. "Sit down, counselor." She turned her gaze back to Noah, then to Shadow, then to the boy, then to the object on the floor, the necklace that told a story no adult had dared say out loud. Finally she spoke. "I've seen trained dogs follow commands," she said slowly, "but I've never seen one deliver justice. There are moments in courtrooms when the law forgets how to breathe." The judge sat frozen. The bailiff's pen hovered above his notepad mid-scratch. Reporters looked up from screens. Even Shadow, calm and ever watchful, didn't blink. Everyone turned to the voice that had just broken through the heavy silence like a sunrise after weeks of storm. A child, small frame, big eyes, bruises not yet faded. He stood beside the CPS officer, fists clenched at his sides, his chest rising and falling like he'd run a mile to get those words out. "That's mine," the boy said again, voice barely above a whisper but steady. "He broke it. Shadow saved me." And then he moved. No hesitation. The boy ran, down the aisle, past pews filled with people who suddenly realized they were no longer witnesses to a case but to a reckoning. His feet slapped against the polished floor. His eyes locked on the one soul in the room he trusted. Not the judge, not the adults flanking him, not even the mother who wept silently at the front row, but the dog. Shadow. The German shepherd sat tall, still as stone, waiting. When the boy reached him, he didn't stop. He dropped to his knees, threw his arms around Shadow's neck, and buried his face in the thick fur of the dog's chest. Noah didn't move. His hands gripped the wheels of his chair so tightly his knuckles paled. His mouth stayed shut, but something in his jaw trembled just slightly. Shadow let out a low whine. Not a bark, not a warning, just a sound like relief dressed in fur. The boy sobbed, not loudly, but with the kind of tears that only come after too long pretending not to be scared. No one spoke. Even the prosecutor's mouth had gone dry. The judge removed her glasses. "This is highly irregular," she murmured, but the sentence held no real rebuke, only a tremor of humanity pushing through the black robes. The boy turned his head, looked at Noah. "He didn't hurt anyone?" the boy said. "Not the dog? Not him? They helped me?" Someone in the gallery wiped away tears. The reporter from Channel 6 put her phone down, not to record, but to feel. The boy continued, "He told me with his hand. He didn't yell. He didn't ask me to lie. He just let me stay." "And Shadow?" the judge asked gently, leaning forward. The boy nodded. "He knew I was scared. He just sat there. Let me hold him. He's not a bad dog. He's a hero." Shadow lifted his head slightly as if acknowledging the word. Hero. The judge turned to the CPS worker. "Has the boy ever spoken to you before?" The woman shook her head, eyes wide. "Not once." The room inhaled. The prosecutor stood slowly. "Your Honor, this child's statement, while powerful, was not part of official testimony. It was not cross-examined." The judge's voice was firm now. "Counselor, you will not object to the truth when it chooses to speak for itself." Then, to the court, "This boy has spoken more courage in 30 seconds than most of us manage in a lifetime." Noah lowered his head, eyes misting. The boy, still clinging to Shadow, looked up once more. "Can I stay with him?" he asked softly. "With them?" It wasn't a legal request, not yet. But it was enough to make the courtroom fall utterly silent again. Not from order, not from fear, but from the fragile sound of something breaking open. Hope. Judge Miriam Holbrook had presided over 1,000 cases. She'd seen hardened criminals, grieving parents, forged apologies, and expert liars. But never before had she seen a child's voice tear through legal armor like this. She sat back, adjusting the collar of her robe as if it had suddenly become too tight. The courtroom was still. No gavel could summon a silence like this. Only truth could. The boy still knelt beside Shadow, his fingers curled into the thick fur at the dog's neck, like he was anchoring himself to something steady in a world that had spun too far off course. Noah, sitting stone still in his wheelchair, watched the judge, not pleading, not posturing, just watching. Like a man who had long ago stopped expecting fairness, but never stopped recognizing it. Holbrook inhaled deeply. Then she spoke, not with the authority of the bench, but the clarity of someone remembering her purpose. "This court recognizes that something extraordinary has taken place here today," she said, her voice firm but filled with unmistakable emotion. She turned toward the prosecution. "Mr. Harris, I ask you plainly, do you wish to proceed with criminal charges against a veteran who has, up until this moment, not uttered a single word in his defense, and yet whose actions continue to speak volumes?" The prosecutor hesitated. "Your Honor, our case is built on precedent and evidence." She raised a hand. "And yet what we witnessed today wasn't precedent, it was revelation. Her eyes fell on Malene Renaer, the mother who had just hours earlier defended her husband under oath. The woman couldn't meet the judge's gaze now. She sat trembling, hands balled in her lap, mascara staining the sleeves of her pale blouse. Judge Holbrook leaned forward. "I am ordering an immediate investigation into the Renner household past and present," she said. "All social services files, CPS records, emergency calls, everything. I want it on my desk within 72 hours. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. She looked at Noah next. "Sergeant Carrigan," she said, the use of his title deliberate and reverent, "you've sat through these proceedings with restraint that frankly shames the rest of us. You responded to pain not with retaliation but protection. You acted not from impulse, but instinct. And you placed the well-being of a child who is not your blood nor your responsibility above your own freedom." Noah's throat twitched. He gave a subtle nod, a thank you without sound. Shadow remained motionless, alert, as if he understood the weight of every syllable being spoken. "In recognition of the evidence presented, both forensic and human, I am suspending all charges against you, effective immediately." Gasps, relief, and a faint exhale from the gallery. Noah didn't cry, but his grip loosened on the arms of his chair. His shoulders, for the first time in months, settled an inch lower. The judge continued. "Furthermore, I am sealing the preliminary report submitted to media outlets. We have enough misinformation in the world. Let us not add to it under the guise of public interest." The prosecutor opened his mouth to argue, but closed it again. There was no winning this battle. Not today. Holbrook looked to the bailiff. "Escort the boy to CPS Holding and notify the department that I will be assigning a special guardian ad litem to his case, independent of current handlers." The child looked up, startled. Then he turned to Noah, walked over, stood beside the wheelchair like he had always belonged there. He didn't ask permission. He simply reached out and placed his small hand on Noah's knee. Shadow wagged his tail once. A beat passed. Two lives broken differently, healed silently, now anchored by a dog who hadn't needed words to speak the truth. The judge's voice softened just enough for humanity to cut through the formality. "We're not always given the justice we seek," she said. "But sometimes it finds us anyway." She tapped the gavel once, not loudly, just enough to mark the moment. "Recess, until further notice." And then she stood. But before she could leave the bench, she paused. Her gaze drifted again to the boy, then to Shadow, then to Noah, and quietly, only loud enough for the stenographer to catch it, she added, "Some stories don't need to be told in full to be understood." Noah Carrigan didn't move, even as the judge stepped down from the bench, even as murmurs rippled through the room like wind through tall grass, even as the bailiff gave him a subtle nod of acknowledgment, a gesture usually reserved for men in uniform or men in grief. He just sat there, still, one hand resting on the arm of his wheelchair, the other hanging loosely, trembling slightly, as if his body had been holding its breath for too many months and still wasn't sure it was safe to exhale. And then he did. A single breath, deep, soundless. It left him like smoke from a long-doused fire. Beside him, Shadow shifted. The old German shepherd didn't bark, didn't move toward the door. He simply lowered himself with the quiet grace of a soldier coming off duty. One paw curled beneath his chest. One eye, the one that remained, blinked slowly. Then it closed. And in that moment, the entire courtroom felt it. That stillness, that ending. No cheering, no applause, no grand hugs or dramatic collapses, because this wasn't a victory like the ones on the news. This was something older, quieter, like finding shelter after the storm has already passed and soaked everything you own. The boy now, sitting on the floor near Shadow, didn't ask to be taken anywhere. He just leaned against the dog, like a barnacle to the only unmoving surface in his life. His little hand rose and fell gently with Shadow's breath, and no one told him to move. Not the bailiff, not the attorneys, not even the CPS officer now waiting near the exit, eyes darting between protocol and human instinct. Everyone understood. This wasn't a scene to be touched. Near the gallery benches, the reporter who had scribbled notes non-stop for 3 days now held her pen still in midair. Something about the sight before her had stilled even that journalistic reflex. Some truths, she realized, don't translate well into ink. At the far end of the room, the prosecutor packed his papers slowly, deliberately, as though unsure what to make of the silence. He glanced toward the defense table, and for just a flicker, his expression changed. Not regret, not even apology. Recognition of what it takes to live through something and still stay kind, of what it means to be judged, not for what you've endured, but for how long you can endure it without demanding to be seen. He looked away quickly, left without another word. The sound of the judge's footsteps faded beyond the chamber door. A low creak echoed from the courtroom pews as someone stood, a woman in her late 60s, gray hair tied in a tight bun, the same woman who had been in the gallery every day but never spoken. She placed something on the seat behind her, a small card, and walked out. Noah watched her go with calm eyes. He didn't know her, but somehow he understood her. There are people in the world who carry truth not in their mouths, but in the way they stand, in the way they choose not to leave when everything says they should. He looked down at Shadow. The old dog raised his head slightly, just enough to meet Noah's eyes. No words, no signal. But Noah reached down and touched his head anyway. A stroke not of ownership, but of gratitude, of survival. The boy murmured something inaudible, not a full word, just sound. Breath wrapped in fear, slowly letting itself unravel. Noah leaned forward. He didn't speak. He never needed to. Instead, he opened his hand palm up. The child stared at it for a long second, then placed his own inside. Tiny fingers into scarred ones. That was all. The courtroom didn't cheer. The cameras didn't flash. And yet something had been restored in that stillness. Not justice by law, but something older than law. Something human. The kind of truth that didn't need headlines. The kind that didn't rise up in speeches or sound bites, but rather lived in the space between heartbeat and breath, a truth too deep for words. As the last few people trickled out of the room, someone gently closed the courtroom doors behind them. And in the quiet that remained, Noah closed his eyes for just a second. The boy leaned into his shoulder. Shadow let out a long, slow sigh and slept. And the room, once filled with suspicion, accusation, and noise, finally fell into the kind of silence that didn't demand anything back. A silence that, for the first time in a long time, felt like peace. It began with a blurry, slightly tilted phone video. Someone from the gallery, probably not even trying to record at first, had held up their phone instinctively when the boy walked forward and said, "That's mine. He broke it. Shadow saved me." The voice was soft, the courtroom silent. But the internet had ears like wildfire. 12 hours later, the video had 500,000 views. By morning, 3 million. By the end of the week, it crossed 12 million. The algorithm didn't need a PR team when a child's whisper could echo louder than any scream. The title wasn't subtle. The Day a Dog Told the Truth. Clips spread like cracks through concrete, each one capturing different angles of the same moment. The child's outstretched hand, the one-eyed dog rising with calm certainty, the silent Marine sitting still as the courtroom shifted around him. Some added slow motion, some added piano music. One edit looped the child's hug with a soft fade and text. "Heroes don't always wear uniforms. Some wear fur." By the third day, reporters were parked outside Noah Carrigan's apartment like buzzards circling a miracle. They knocked with polite persistence, left notes, cards, business numbers, offers. "Noah, this is Lauren from NBC. Can we talk about your story?" "Mr. Carrigan, we'd love to feature you and Shadow in our Hero Dog segment." "CNN, sir, just 5 minutes. Your silence speaks volumes." Noah didn't open the door, not once. Inside, his apartment remained as it had always been, modest, clean, silent. The only sound came from the slow click of Shadow's claws on linoleum, or the occasional scrape of Noah's wheelchair when he rolled to the window to peek at the world that now suddenly cared. But not about him, about the moment. A viral fragment, a flash of truth torn from context, remixed, overdubbed, and sold as inspiration. Noah understood why people were moved. He wasn't angry, but he was wary. Because the same public that could crown you a hero in the morning would question your sanity by nightfall if the next headline turned. He fed Shadow in the dim light of the kitchen, the only room where the blinds stayed open. The dog ate quietly, like always. No gulping. No mess. They were both like that. Silent until necessary. Across the street, a journalist stood under a black umbrella, hoping the rain might soften him. It didn't. Noah drew the curtain. His phone buzzed again. He didn't check it, but the screen lit long enough to flash a message across the dark. 62 new messages. Voicemail full. He turned the phone face down. Shadow padded over and sat beside him, not demanding, just there. Noah reached out, no command, no gesture, just a hand resting lightly on Shadow's shoulder. His breath came steady, deeper now. He was home. But home no longer meant quiet. It meant boundaries. It meant deciding what parts of your truth the world was allowed to borrow and what it had no right to touch. The boy had gone back into care for now, but word had it that CPS was being flooded with petitions, letters, even donations. Thousands of strangers wanted to help the brave boy and his dog. They didn't know the boy's name. They didn't know the dog's story. But they felt something, and maybe that was enough to make them care for a while. Outside, someone knocked again. Noah didn't move. He reached for the remote and turned on the only thing that still felt familiar, an old war documentary. Not because he needed the reminders, but because the voices were honest there. Grit didn't ask to be filmed. Shadow rested his head on Noah's knee. Noah closed his eyes for a moment. In a world that now saw him as a headline, a miracle, a curiosity, this dog still saw him. Not the version gone viral, not the soldier, not the man in the chair. Just Noah. And that, somehow, was enough. It was raining again. Pittsburgh, rain-thin and gray, falling not in sheets but in soft, endless threads that blurred the sky and made the world feel quieter. Noah was at the corner bodega just past midnight. He liked the hour. The aisles were empty, and the man behind the counter never asked questions, only nodded when Noah entered and gave Shadow a soft, "Hey, buddy," without trying to pet him. Shadow always stayed close, no leash needed. He didn't stray, not in grocery aisles, not in parking lots, not in war, and not now. Noah had just finished paying when he saw her. She wasn't like the others. No boom mic, no camera crew, no branded windbreaker. Just a woman in jeans and a water-specked notebook, standing in the shadows of the awning, soaked to the knees. She didn't speak until he wheeled past. "Mr. Carrigan," she said gently, "I'm not here for a headline. I'm here because I don't know how to forget what I saw." Noah paused. Shadow turned, ears twitching. The woman stepped forward. "I've reported a lot of courtroom drama, scandals, sensational stuff. But what your dog did, what that boy said, it wasn't just news. It was something good, something true." She didn't ask for a comment. She didn't shove a phone toward him. She just stood there, like someone trying to make sense of a feeling she couldn't quite write down. "I'm not here to twist anything," she added, her voice lowering. "I just wanted to ask why you did it." Noah didn't answer at first. He looked out at the empty street. Shadow sat beside his wheelchair, unmoving, a silent sentinel under the dim awning light. Then Noah leaned forward slightly. His voice was rough-scarred by war, nearly claimed by trauma, but clear. "This wasn't about a headline," he said. "It was about a boy who needed someone to stay. That was all. Just 16 words. But the way he said it, the stillness behind the syllables, the way his hand dropped gently to rest on Shadow's back, told her more than any interview could have. The journalist, her name was Kara Blake, a freelancer from the Tribune, nodded once, and didn't press. She wrote down his words slowly. Then she closed the notebook, tucked it away, and looked at him for a moment longer. "Thank you for not walking away," she whispered. Noah offered the smallest nod, the kind that said, "You're welcome," but it wasn't really a choice. He wheeled past her without another word, Shadow padding along in rhythm beside him. Kara didn't follow. She just stood there under the awning, the rain softening her outline, watching the silhouette of a man and a dog disappear into the night. By morning, the quote would appear in her op-ed knot, framed in bold, not screaming for clicks, but resting in the final paragraph like a quiet benediction. This wasn't about a headline. It was about a boy who needed someone to stay. Noah Carrigan, former Marine, now silent guardian, to the child who spoke because he finally felt safe. There would be no follow-up interview, no profile piece, just those words, untouched. But somehow they would reach more people than the viral video ever could. The name came to him on a night like any other, quiet, overcast shadow lying by his side while a storm rolled far in the distance. He'd been sitting at his desk, one hand absently tracing the edge of a photo shadow, just weeks after coming home from Afghanistan, his left eye still bandaged, his posture alert despite the weight of sedation. The photo was creased at the corners, handled too often, never framed. Noah's thumb hovered over the paper just above Shadow's head. Then he picked up a pen and wrote 2 words in the margin. Echo Bridge. It wasn't just a name. It was everything they'd become together, a link between what had been silenced and what still had something to say. The idea wasn't complicated. Too many veterans came home broken in ways that couldn't be stitched up. Some lost their voices, some lost their legs, some lost more invisible things, like the ability to trust, to sleep, to hope. And too many dogs, once heroes themselves, were discarded after duty. Shadow had shown Noah what could happen when two broken beings didn't try to fix each other, but simply chose to stay. So Echo Bridge would be that choice formalized. A nonprofit dedicated to training retired police and military dogs to work with disabled veterans, especially those with speech impairments or PTSD-induced communication barriers. The goal wasn't flashy, no press kits, no million-dollar campaigns, just one vet, one dog, one bridge between silence and life again. At the first meeting, held in a repurposed community hall, only 6 people showed up. 2 veterans, both in wheelchairs. One woman who used a voice-assistive device, a retired canine handler, a shelter rep, and a boy, small, shy, who never let go of Shadow's fur. Yes, that boy. He didn't talk much still, but he came to every planning session. Shadow had become his bridge, too. By spring, they had 20 applications and 4 trained dogs. Noah taught the sessions using hand signals and writing boards, but it was Shadow who did the real work. When a vet struggled to sleep, Shadow lay beside their bed, unmoving, guarding dreams. When a man stuttered so hard he cried, Shadow nudged his hand gently, then waited until the breathing slowed. When one of the dogs, Retta, a retired narcotics canine, panicked from the sound of a slamming door, Shadow simply stood beside her. No bark, no correction, just presence. The team called it the Shadow Method. But Noah never claimed credit. He said healing couldn't be taught, it could only be witnessed. Local papers started covering the group, not in a sensational way this time, but with reverence. One headline read, "Where warriors walk again with 4 paws beside them." Another, more quietly, "Echo Bridge, a place where no one has to speak to be understood." A woman from the mayor's office came to tour the training site. She left in tears. And still, Noah never gave interviews. He let others speak now. The veterans, the dogs, the small stories that never made national news, but saved lives in slow, deliberate ways. In the hallway of their new center, a modest, donated warehouse they'd converted into a sunlit training space, hung a single framed photo, the same one from Noah's desk. Beneath it, carved into reclaimed oak, were the words, "Some bridges aren't made of steel or stone. Some are built from loyalty and fur and silence that listens." And beside it, a small brass plate, "Shadow, founding guardian, not just a dog." Echo Bridge didn't change the world overnight, but it did change someone's world, one by one. And that, for Noah, was enough. Shadow still slept beside his bed every night. Sometimes, when the wind rose or the dreams clawed back, Noah would reach out without looking and feel that one familiar weight press against his chest. Not demanding, just reminding. He wasn't alone, not anymore. And neither were the others. The old warehouse didn't look like much from the outside, but inside, Echo Bridge was a sanctuary, not soft and easy, but honest. A place where silence was heavy, hands shook, and dogs bore scars no one asked about. On Monday mornings, the quiet warriors gathered. Men and women who'd been to the edge and back, some in wheelchairs, some walking with canes, some carrying invisible wounds. Noah sat near the training ring. Shadow watched the door like he was waiting for an old friend. There was Dutch, who approached no one until he laid his head in Eli's lap. Eli hadn't spoken in 6 months. That day, he whispered, "Dutch." Blaze, the bomb detection dog, paced at every sound until Lisa breathed with him through panic. And Rex failed out twice. Too reactive found his match in Marcus. During a flashback, Rex placed his paws on Marcus's chest, anchoring him back to the present. Noah passed Marcus a note. He growled because he felt it coming. That's not aggression. That's protection. Something shifted that day. No speeches, no drama, just people who stopped pretending, and dogs who never asked them to. The letters came, unasked for, from VA clinics, kitchen tables, hospital beds. Eli's was short. Dutch waits for me during the nightmares. First time in years I've gone 2 weeks without my inhaler. Thank you. Lisa's was longer. Blaze lays across my feet when my heart races. He's louder than the past, and that's enough. A grainy video showed a boy hugging a shepherd's neck. "Thank you, Jet, for giving my daddy back." From a widow. Willow rests her head on my lap every night like she's holding the grief for me. Noah printed every letter, pinned them to a corkboard under a sign. They came home different, but they came home. One morning, a little girl asked, "Are these from people your dog saved?" Noah placed her hand on Shadow's head. "No, they're from people he helped stay." The memorial outside Allegheny wasn't famous. It didn't need to be. 2 columns, soldiers on the left, dogs on the right. Noah stopped at K9 Kirby, KIA 14-C, 2009 saved. 7, lost himself. Shadow's breath changed. He'd run beside some of these dogs, shared water bowls, curled beside them when the heat cracked thermometers. Some he'd watched fall. Noah's hand shook at SGT, Luis Ramos. He held the line long enough for others to live. Luis had told him, it's not about coming back the same, it's about coming back still willing to feel. At the grove of the silenced just collars, no plaques. Noah added one more. Milo's. A dog who belonged to a Marine who didn't make it. Shadow lowered his head. Nearby, a young woman with a new recruit nodded to Noah. No words. They weren't needed. At the base of the stone, we do not mourn them because they were dogs. We honor them because they were soldiers. Noah whispered. Shadow heard. Together they sat, holding space for the ones who didn't come home. Because grief wasn't weakness. It was proof they'd loved enough to remember. The invitation came on thick paper, decorated in red, white, and blue marker streaks. Dear Mr. Noah and Shadow, will you come to our Veterans Week assembly? We want to meet a real hero. Mrs. Pritchard's 4th grade class. Noah stared at it for 2 days. Not because he didn't want to go, but because being seen had always been harder than talking. Shadow waited by the door, calm, watching, ready. On assembly morning, autumn air carried the scent of leaves surrendering to fall. Kids filled the auditorium, sneakers squeaking, voices loud. A banner hung above the stage. Thank you, veterans. Noah rolled in quietly. Mrs. Pritchard greeted him, kind but nervous. The kids are excited. Shadow's even more famous than you. Shadow moved with him, vest snug, steps sure. Retired but alert. A quiet presence that drew every eye. The principal called for quiet. We're honored to welcome a Marine veteran and his partner, K9 Shadow. Applause. A girl clutched a plush German shepherd toy. "That's him!" Noah stopped short of the mic and gave a hand signal. Shadow stepped forward, scanned the room, then sat. One bark firm, not loud. The room fell silent. Noah spoke quietly. "This dog once ran into fire for me. Now he walks into silence for kids like you." A girl whispered, "He means feelings." Noah nodded. Mrs. Pritchard asked, "Would you show us how you and Shadow talk?" Noah gave subtle signals. Shadow approached the girl with the toy, gently nudged her hand. She giggled like wind chimes. Applause followed, not polite, but awed. Afterward, a boy with a stutter offered a drawing of Shadow in a cape. "I'm not good at saying things, but when I'm scared, I hug my dog. It helps." Noah tapped his chest twice. The boy's eyes widened. Mrs. Pritchard explained, "It means I understand." In the hallway, kids lined up offering high fives and thank yous. Shadow moved among them, calm and warm. But one girl stayed behind. Dark braids, oversized cardigan. She clutched her backpack tight. Shadow paused before her, ears forward, not alarmed, just attentive. She looked at Noah. "Does Shadow know what justice means?" Noah saw it in her eyes, the kind that had learned some people never say sorry. He knelt, bracing on his chair. Shadow sat between them. "No," Noah said. "He doesn't know what justice means." He pointed at Shadow's chest. "But he knows what love means. And that's all justice ever is when it's done right." She loosened her grip on her backpack. From it she pulled a worn notebook, a crayon drawing of a girl, a dog with a patch over one eye, and the words, "Some heroes listen." She handed it to Noah. "Can you give this to him?" Noah tucked it over his heart. Shadow leaned forward, touched her fingers gently. Outside, leaves scraped the sidewalk. Noah wheeled toward the van. Shadow climbed in first. Inside, Noah looked again at the drawing. Shadow rested his head on Noah's lap. Justice didn't always need a verdict. Sometimes it just needed to sit still and listen. The porch didn't creak anymore. Noah had fixed the loose boards last fall, one slow plank at a time, on the days his knees didn't lock up, and his shoulder didn't scream from old shrapnel lodged too close to the nerve. It wasn't much of a view, just a patchy front yard, a wooden fence leaning like an old man exhaling, and a wind chime made of spoons that a neighbor's kid had crafted from her grandmother's cutlery drawer. But today, with the breeze running soft and steady through the leaves, it felt like the most honest place in the world. Noah sat in the same chair he always did, worn, unpainted, built solid. Shadow lay at his feet, one eye watching the street, one ear flicking at flies too slow to bother with. His muzzle was whiter now, frost where fire used to be. But his presence? Still a mountain, still home. The headlines had faded. 12 million views had given way to newer tragedies, newer heroes, newer stories. And that was fine. Noah didn't miss the noise. Didn't miss the cameras or the spotlights or the well-meaning interviews with people who wanted him to cry on cue. Didn't miss the way some tried to turn Shadow into a symbol without ever asking what the dog wanted. There was a time he would have taken their offers, a time when being seen felt like the closest thing to mattering. But now, on this porch, under this sky, with nothing left to prove and no war left to fight, he chose quiet. The wind chimes rattled gently, not in chaos, not loud, just enough to remind the world it was still moving. Noah watched the way Shadow breathed, the rise and fall of a rib cage that had taken blasts, bullets, and heartbreak. The chest that once strained against trauma vests now rested easy in the sun. Noah ran a hand down his neck, slow. Shadow's tail tapped the wooden floor twice. No words. They didn't need them. They hadn't in a long time. Across the street, a sprinkler came on. The hiss of water against dry lawn. Somewhere down the block, kids laughed, short bursts of joy that didn't carry weight or context, just freedom. And closer still, just beyond the porch rail, a squirrel darted across the grass. Shadow watched it. Didn't chase. Didn't even get up. His mission wasn't chasing anymore. It was staying. Noah leaned back. His throat still tightened some days. The voice hadn't come all the way back. Maybe it never would. But silence no longer felt like failure. It felt like space. Space to feel, space to remember, space to exist without needing to explain. Inside the house, the TV was off. The nonprofit ran itself now, more or less. Volunteers came by on Thursdays. Emails were handled by a quiet Marine named Saul, who knew better than to call unless it was urgent. And the boy Michael was with a foster family now. A good one. Safe. Healing. Sometimes he sent letters, sometimes just drawings. The last one was a crayon picture of a dog with one eye standing beside a man with no mouth, but a big, big heart. Noah kept it on the fridge. He hadn't told anyone, but he looked at it every morning. The sun climbed a little higher. Shadow shifted, leaning his weight subtly against Noah's leg. The contact was brief but clear. "I'm here. You're not alone." "Still standing, soldier." Noah closed his eyes. Let the wind wash over him. Let the silence stretch. He had spent so many years running from things that didn't make sense, from pain that didn't come with answers, from memories that clawed through sleep and surfaced in the stillest hours of the night. But now he didn't run. He just sat. With a dog who had never asked for anything but a place to rest, a purpose to hold, and someone who saw him beyond the vest and commands. A butterfly landed on the porch rail. Shadow didn't move. Noah watched it for a long time, watched it twitch and fan its wings, and then float off like peace didn't need an announcement. The wind chimes sang again, this time a little louder. Not because the wind had picked up, but because the moment allowed it. Because this was a day without noise. And for once, that wasn't emptiness. It was fullness. It was enough. The hallway inside Echo Bridge was never meant to impress. There were no portraits of donors, no polished marble floors, no grand reception desk, just a worn wooden bench with chew marks on the leg. Courtesy of a German shepherd pup named Kilo, who'd flunked out of detection training but became a perfect PTSD alert dog. The walls were matte white, scuffed in places from muddy paws and the occasional tail wag collision with leash hooks. It smelled faintly of cedar chips, coffee, and dog shampoo. And at the very end of that hall, mounted just below eye level, was a plaque. Simple, unvarnished, brushed steel against reclaimed barnwood. The engraving read, "Dedicated to the ones who speak without words, in honor of Shadow and all the silent voices that saved us." No spotlights lit it, no frame encased it, but people stopped. Veterans, visitors, students, parents. They paused there, not to admire, but to feel. Noah didn't visit that hallway often, not because it was painful, but because he didn't need to. He had carried those words in his chest since the day he first etched them with the soldering pen hands trembling, breath caught somewhere between grief and grace. That day Shadow had sat behind him, not watching, just being, just close. Now, years later, the plaque remained untouched, unchanged, but the hallway had grown. Around it bloomed life, walls now lined with photographs, not of battles, but of aftermaths. A Marine in a wheelchair, laughing with a golden retriever licking his chin. A woman who'd lost both legs sitting in the grass while a Malinois leaned into her side, eyes closed. A child on the autism spectrum tracing her fingers across the fur of a dog while mouthing her very first word, safe. Below every photo, no captions, just names, and above all of it, that plaque. It didn't boast. It reminded. Noah stood there now, his fingertips grazing the edge. Shadow rested at his side, slower these days, but alert as ever. His one eye scanned the hallway, then returned to Noah as if reading not just posture, but pulse. Noah's lips parted slightly, but he said nothing. Didn't need to. Shadow leaned gently into his leg. From the therapy room behind them, a new handler called out softly, "Kai, let's go." A rustle of movement followed. Then the soft pad of paws on the floor. A veteran with visible tremors walked slowly beside a tall shepherd with mismatched eyes. The dog matched his pace perfectly, one step behind, never pushing, just following, just listening, just ready. They passed Noah and Shadow in the hallway, both nodding in silent greeting. The plaque shimmered faintly in the ambient light. Kai paused, sniffed toward the wall, tilted her head, and then, with no cue at all, she sat. Still, present, watching. The veteran smiled. "Guess she knows what matters," he said. Noah met his gaze and offered a rare half-grin. He pointed to the plaque and placed 2 fingers on his own chest, then tapped the dog. The veteran understood. "So they can hear us even when we can't speak?" Noah nodded once. Shadow's tail thumped soft, affirming. Down the hall, someone laughed. In another room, a bell chimed, signaling that a pair had completed their trust test. The building buzzed, not with volume, but with vibration, a kind of low hum that came from shared breath, quiet courage, and healing that didn't make noise. That plaque was its anchor, a reminder that strength doesn't always bark. Sometimes it just stays. Once a week, someone would add a small token beneath the plaque. Today, it was a braided collar with a single bronze tag. The name etched Juno. No dates, no medals, just love and presence. Noah placed a hand over the plaque once more, then turned away, walking slowly with Shadow beside him. The hallway faded behind them, but the feeling stayed. In the walls, in the air, in the dogs learning to listen, and the people learning to breathe again. In the truth carved into metal and wood, dedicated to the ones who speak without words. They had spoken, they had been heard, and now their silence filled the world with meaning. The porch faced west, always had. It caught the last gold of the sun as it slipped behind the hills, painting the trees in long strokes of amber and shadow. Tonight it burned softer, hushed. Noah sat in his usual chair, a faded wool blanket across his lap. His body older now, still marked by war and time, leaned slightly to the right, where warmth waited. Shadow lay curled beside him, his graying muzzle resting on Noah's boot. The wind was barely a whisper, but even in stillness, the chimes above gave off a low, hollow, note-like breath through an old flute. The world had quieted over the years, not in sadness, not in absence, but in a kind of earned peace. There were no reporters now, No courtrooms, no cameras, just days spent tending to Echo Bridge, nights filled with steady dreams, and between them, the rhythm of breath theirs, Noah and Shadow, always together, always listening. Shadow shifted slightly, a soft groan in his throat. Not pain, just age. Noah turned his head. His lips didn't move, but his fingers did. A slow curl of 3 knuckles, followed by the brush of his thumb over his palm. A command he hadn't used in months. "You're okay. Rest." Shadow's one eye opened, cloudy but warm. He saw it. He understood. And his tail thin now, the fur rougher than before, thumped once against the porch floor. Just once. But it said everything. The sun lowered. Noah reached down and gently placed his hand atop Shadow's neck, feeling the steady heartbeat beneath. He didn't think about the war, or the trial, or the days spent in silence when no one believed him except this dog. He thought instead of the first time they met. A compound in Helmand, dust in the air, gunfire in the distance, and this dog, a blur of muscle, instinct, and something Noah couldn't name back then, standing over him after the explosion, refusing to leave even as his own eye bled into the dust. He thought of the apartment back in Pittsburgh, when neither of them could sleep, when every creak in the floorboards felt like danger. And it was Shadow who pressed against his chest, grounding him again and again until the dreams began to lose their claws. And he remembered the boy, the one with bruises that faded, but eyes that never forgot. The way he ran down the courtroom aisle, not to Noah, but to the dog who knew, who saw. Noah's eyes misted, but he didn't wipe them. Some moments deserve to be blurred. He exhaled slowly, letting the weight of the years settle into his chest like a lullaby. Shadow's breathing had grown shallow, but peaceful. Still, the dog stayed alert. One ear turned slightly, picking up Noah's breath, his presence. Even now, with dusk descending and the first stars blinking through the veil, they were not alone. They were with. Inside the house, a light flickered on. Echo Bridge volunteers moved quietly in the background, respecting the moment without needing to ask. Because by now, everyone knew. When Noah and Shadow sat on the porch at sunset, it wasn't just routine. It was ritual. The camera pulls back slowly, like memory stepping out of the present. We see the porch, the two of them, a man and his dog side by side. No leash, no command, just connection. Noah lifts one hand barely, fingers spread, palm open. "Thank you." Shadow lifts his head. His tail moves again, just once, and then he lowers it back down, resting fully this time, body curled into the crook of Noah's chair. Their silhouettes stretch with the fading light, merging at the feet, dissolving into one long, seamless shape. Not man, not dog, just something sacred, something whole. The final chime sings in the breeze, and silence, blessed and boundless, settles like grace over the porch. In a world that often measures value by volume, this story reminds us of the quiet strength found in loyalty, presence, and unconditional love. Shadow, a once-forgotten German shepherd, and Noah, a wounded veteran, didn't need words to rebuild each other. Together they created a life not defined by what was lost, but by what endured. Their bond became more than companionship. It became testimony that healing doesn't always come loud, that justice can come from a bark a glance, a stillness that refuses to break, and that sometimes the most powerful voices come from those who have learned to listen first. German shepherds like Shadow, brave, intelligent, and fiercely loyal, remind us that animals are not just dogs. They are guardians of our pain, silent translators of our truths, and often the only ones who see us fully when the world looks away. Let this story be a reminder. Adopt, protect, believe. Somewhere out there a dog waits, not to be saved, but to save someone in return. And in that meeting, something wordless yet eternal will begin, because the truest conversations are not spoken. They're understood. They're